Okay, so just a quick reminder from last week's session number one, and just a recap. So what of maybe a few particular tribes in particular that make their way across to Ireland eventually. And obviously, if you've been around the fellowship, you'll know that in the fellowship we believe that in general that the Anglo-Saxon Celtic people are the descendants of the tribes of Israel. Doesn't make them any better than anyone else, than the Gentiles, but what it does is it confirms God's word that it's true. And I was just thinking before I came on, the importance of this gives you confidence also to recognize who the nations are at these end times before the Lord returns. Now, we're going way back in history at this moment in time. If you look at the timeline of down here for a second, you'll see that Joseph dies in 1805 BC, before Christ. Joseph was taken down into Egypt. Actually, I just noticed those dates are different to what Helen Duncan has. Anyway, nonetheless, we're talking about 1700, 1800 BC. So we're going back nearly the same length of time that we are after Christ, if that makes sense. And the three tribes that we're going to look at in particular, especially when we get to Ireland at the end, is the tribe of Simeon, down here where you see the castle and the sword, the tribe of Dan, which is usually the eagle and the snake, and also the tribe of Judah, which has the red line and the red hand. It also has the three lions, and this line, which you might recognize from if you ever watch the English football team, they have the three lions, or the rugby team. Or if you ever look at Scotland, they have the crouching lion. And also in Ireland, even before we get to there, you've probably seen the red hand of Ulster. So in order to get there, we have to go way back. So when Joseph was second in command, and he was very much up with the Pharaoh at the time. He became the second in command, and he'd 7 good years and the 7 bad years. And then eventually he reveals himself to his brothers. And eventually, that generation dies off, but their descendants are now in Egypt. And most of us know about the main Exodus, where under Moses, they moved to Palestine. But there's evidence to suggest that during that period of time, that this tribe of Judah, and in particular, we'll see that there's a set of twins, which we'll have a look at in a few minutes, called Zarah and Phares. So on their family tree, the Phares line eventually goes on to King David and on to Jesus Christ, as we'll see in a while. But the Zarah line, who's the first child, they may have ruled in Egypt. I think it's up the south or the north. I can't quite remember which end it was. For a while in Egypt, that they were in control, and they may have been known as the Hyksos kings, which means the shepherd kings. Now remember, the Israelites were shepherds, and Joseph had warned his brethren when they were coming into Egypt, don't let Pharaoh know that you're shepherds, because it's an abomination to the Egyptians. But later on, as they come into to be the ruling class, they now can be who they want to be, the shepherds. But what happens is the pharaohs, as often happens in countries, somebody rules for a while, then the pharaohs got back the control of Egypt, and they'd forgotten who Joseph was and all of them, and they really became very hard on foreigners. Hence the reason we get the main Exodus, where Moses and the people start to cry unto the Lord, and he moves them out. And we're very familiar with that. But before that, these people under the Zarah line of the tribe of Judah, not all Judah, just that particular line, some of that ruling class started to leave Egypt and head for places like Greece. So that's where we were at, on the Zarah line. Then during the time of the Exodus, when they're in the wilderness, there's quite a few situations that occur where, in particular, there's a bit of a clash between Simeon and Levi. So Levi and Simeon, as we'd seen before, they're really hotheads. The Levites eventually become the butchers and look after all the sacrificial stuff in the Old Testament. We're familiar with that. But Simeon, what happens is one of the lords of the tribe of Simeon, a guy called Zimri. He brings in a Midianite woman, or a foreign woman, into the tribe of Israel after God had just, kind of tried to deliver them from Balaam and the donkey. We all know that scene of Balaam and the donkey. And he defies really God, and he defies Moses, and he's probably challenging Moses' authority. And one of the Pinus gets the javelin, and he kills this guy. So you can imagine, when you've two hotheads, that they could go to civil war. And if you look down on the right-hand side, you'll see that between this incident, there was a census. So just like, when Mary and Joseph were when Mary was about to give birth, of course, she had to go for the Roman census much later on. But in the book of Numbers, it talks about that the Lord had asked Moses to take a census of who could fight for Israel, usually the males. And you can see between these two censuses that 37,100, which is an enormous drop, happens on the tribe of Simeon. Now, I'm suggesting that I don't think that the reason wasn't just the plague. I believe that they started to leave. They got their neck in a twist over what had happened, and they started to migrate. And so now we see at two different moments, before even the children of Israel have got to Palestine or the Promised Land, some of their people have already started to migrate. So that's what we talked about last week. And the other tribe that we mentioned was the tribe of Dan. And in the book of Judges, which is before all the kings, so it's after the time of Joshua, when his generation started to die and the Lord had judges, there's a particular battle that happens under the judge or the prophetess called Deborah. And Deborah goes out to fight this guy called Caesarea. Now, Caesarea may have been a name from Sardinia. And it's when she goes looking for the tribe of Dan to come out and fight, she says, "Where's Dan? He's off in his ships." A bit like us sometimes. "Where's Dan? He's off playing IT games." And what happens then is we see here, there must be a reason why Dan is not about. And if he's off in his ships, it means he's already started to migrate. He's already checking out new lands. And there's a strong possibility that the tribe of Dan had already started to move to some of them, not all of them. Again, I'm talking about some of the tribes in these individual three tribes. They had started to move towards what was called the Aegean or Aegean, which was the old name for Greece, and in particular a place called Mycenae. And apparently Egyptian gold was discovered back in 1200 BC, and it was the tribe of Dan that used to cover the Ark of the Covenant in gold. So there may have been trade links. It's interesting, if you know anything about Greek history, you may have heard of a guy called Hercules. Well, remember that Samson comes from the tribe of Dan, and he's in the book of Judges. And the Greeks and the Romans were notorious for rebranding stories as their own, just much like the Roman Catholic Church rebranded a festival called Saturnalia, and they made it Christmas. And most people are going to celebrate that the next few weeks. But the origins of it was a pagan festival called Saturnalia. So cultures have been doing that for a long time. We know that the snake and the eagle are emblems of Dan, and we'll see Dan kind of went off the trail quite early when you read in the book of Judges that they started to make their own priestly tribe. So they made their own religion. And we can see, obviously, if they're going to migrate, that they'll bring that with them. So that's just a recap of last week. Now, we might have to, again, I'll just try and show you where we're heading with the end of this story. So we're kind of starting over here in the Middle East and Egypt, and we're all familiar with that. And we're going to see how, in particular, some of these three tribes that I've identified here, how they move to Greece. And in particular, I'm going to take Greece, eventually Spain, northern Spain, and eventually on into what was known as Hibernia or Ireland. Some of these we'll know. So the Hyksos kings were really the Zarahs. We're going to see how they went to what is a famous battle in history called the Trojan War. And we'll see how they come in there. And eventually they'll come to Tara. They also, eventually, some of the Zarahites from the Trojans, a guy called Brutus, eventually set up what we know as London. Well, it was originally called New Troy. It was the Romans that called it Londinium, where we get the name London. And Tara, of course, is in what's known as the Royal County of Meath. There's a reason it's the Royal County, because this is back to the royal tribe. We know that Dan is going to come as the Danoni into Greece, or the sea people. And we know that one of the earliest peoples into Ireland were called the Tuatha Danann. And then also Simeon, we're going to see that maybe him and Dan were linked with Sparta, eventually go into Iberia, which is the name for Spain, and eventually onto Hibernia. And you see the name, how Iberia and Hibernia are very similar, and they both come from the root word called Eber, E-B-E-R, who is the father of the Hebrews. So that's where those names stem from. So even before I even start to go into this, you can already see that there's biblical references in the names. This is quite a well-known map of Israel's wanderings, how she wandered through this. We're looking in particular the sea path, how they came in. But of course, later on, when the two countries fell, first the house of Israel, and later on the house of Judah, how they both fell, that eventually they go on. We know about the wandering Jews in 70 AD, how they start to migrate across land, etc., into different countries, making all their way over towards what we know as Western Europe. So that's kind of the end of the tale. So it's just to give you a map of where we're going, that we're looking at the journey. And it's already been, for me, it's already been interesting, even before I go on, learning about the whole Hyksos thing and the fact that they may be linked to the Zara branch of the tribe of Israel. So there's a famous story in Genesis about a lady called Tamar. As you're reading Genesis and the story of Joseph, I think it's chapter 39 off the top of my head, right in the middle is this story that doesn't seem to fit because it's totally back to a brother of Joseph called Judah, and his sons die, and he ends up, if you read the whole story yourself, you'll see how this lady Tamar, who had been married to his son, and in Israel, under that time, she should have gone to the next son so that they could keep the line of the family tree going. And she tricks him, Judah, because he's ignored her. And they eventually get together, and she eventually has twins. And it came to pass at the time of giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread, which is where we get the red hand, and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. So Zarah came out first. Then it happened, as he drew in his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did he break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Pharez or Perez. And afterwards his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread in his hand, and his name was called Zarah. Z-E or Z-A, they're both pronounced the same. So we see a breakdown, a summary, just on the right-hand side, how you see that the Zarah line is here, the scarlet cord, and we're going to see how it links to the Cretan kings, or Crete, which is an island off Greece, eventually goes to the Trojan kings and the Milesian kings, which is kind of the Milesians were a mix of the Zarah line, and also, I believe, the tribe of Simeon, and how they linked to some of the European monarchs just a century gone. The Frankish or the French kings, the Scandinavian kings, down to the Germans, kings of Denmark, the kings of Greece. Philip, who just died recently, is linked on this Zarah line. And also from the Milesian kings, over on this side, we have Pharez, who went down all the way, David, Solomon, and Nathan, all the way down to Zedekiah. And you might recall that Pastor Jock went through a little bit on Zedekiah, who was the last king on the tribe, on the royal tribe of the Pharez line. And it looks like from the Bible as if that was the end of it. But we know that it passed to his daughters, who came across with Jeremiah and linked up with the kings of Ireland, who were already from this Zarah line. So we just see how this links all together, that this Zarah line, this passage of scripture about Zarah and Pharez, has had consequences right up till today, up to Queen Elizabeth, who's from this line when it links back in again, and Zarah takes over the Pharez line. And that's what we're kind of going to see as we move through. So I just wanted to bring that in a little bit. So a summary of the Zarah and the Pharez line, because two names are quite important here. A guy called Kalkol, or Dara, or Darda. Now, even the name Dara automatically straight away should be setting off a few triggers in your brain. Not far from where Cecilia lives is a county called Kildare, which is the Valley of Dara. And not far from where all of us are living is a place called Adare, A-D-A-R-E, which is also from the name Dara. So we already, without even going too far, we see links already. So just coming back to this whole Judah story, because it's kind of important that you kind of pick up the Zarah line and the Pharez line if you can. So under the tribe of Judah, Judah was Joseph's brother, Dan's brother, Simeon's brother, and he'd been promised that through his line, as we've seen on the Pharez line, would come Shiloh, who's Jesus Christ. But on the Zarah line, we see that one of Judah's descendants, which are listed in the family tree, which is interesting because Ireland's called Era, Onan, and Sheila. Sheila is a very common name in Ireland, and also Australia. born from the daughter of Shua the Canaanite, and and Onan died, but Shelah had a son named Shelah is a man in this case, I think. Yeah. The other two sons, Sarah and Pharez, as we just read, were twins of Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Pharez means breach and as indicates the great rivalry that emerged between the lines of Zarah and Pharez, with Pharez gaining the upper hand per the description in Genesis. As we've seen, even though he came out second, he was the one, as you read the book of Kings there from the Pharez line. You don't read in the scriptures about the kings from the Zarah line. You're only reading from the Pharez line. This is the part I want to get over to. So Zarah had 5 sons: Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Chalcol, and Darda. It's interesting that at the time of Solomon, I'll just read out a little scripture, talks about Solomon. He says in 1 Kings 4, verse 31, for he was wiser than all the men, than Ethan and Heman and Chalcol and Darda, and his fame was in all about the nation. So it's interesting that these names are actually wise. These are wise men as well, not quite in the same level as Solomon, but the Lord is saying that Solomon was even wiser than these guys. But these guys were pretty famous back in the day. And where are we going? So the sons, let's just take it from here, because these are the two guys I want to get to. And the sons of Sarai, Sirai, and Ethan, and He-Man. Remember He-Man, the cartoon, when I was growing up? Chalcol and Dara, 5 of them in all. So in some of the historians, they start to say, you might know of a place called the Dardanelles, which is a famous kind of place just off Turkey. It's between Turkey and Greece, famous river. I think it's called the Bosphorus now river. Famous river. It's actually the river the Russians have used to be able to bring their weapons from Crimea down to Syria. That's the river they've used. But it was originally called the Dardanelles. And that name is most likely have come from this guy, Dara or Darda. And why we're getting to this place is because Dardus is the mythical founder of Dardanelles on the Hellespont, an ancestor of the Dardans on the Troy, the area ruled by the Trojans, and became the founder of the royal house of Troy. So we're going to link how this family tree on the Zarah line has now moved from Greece and is moving into being some of the original people into some of the areas between Greece and Turkey. And we're going to, most of us know the famous battle that happens. It's still remembered in Western history, the Battle of Troy. So now at the time of the Western Asia Minor was then inhabited primarily by Greek colonists, but some of those Greeks were in fact Israelites who lived among the Greeks. The Hebrews built an altar to the Lord, thanking him for the deliverance from the Egyptians. The king of Greece visited their camps with his Hebrew servant, telling them to build a fort and fortify themselves against the enemies. Then they commenced to build the city of Troy. So from the Zarah line is coming down now through this guy, and now we're linking it to Greece. Hopefully you see that. So here we go. The face that launched 1,000 ships is a famous saying in Western history. Helen of Troy. Who hasn't heard of Helen of Troy? I'm sure you've seen the movies. There's a recent one, I think, with Brad Pitt, going back a few years, a bit Hollywood-esque, but it gives you a bit of an idea of the story. So the Zarah line of the Judah tribe, we're just reiterating, left Egypt hundreds of years before Moses. The royal blood of Judah through those Zarahites had founded Troy and established the Trojan kingdoms that existed. Those Zarahrites were called the Hyksos, or the shepherd kings, when they were in Egypt, as we seen last week, hundreds of years before. The wealthy people of Zara, remember their royalty, had sailed to Troy, Greece, Spain, and Ireland centuries before Moses led the poor people of the tribes of Israel from Egypt. Zara was the one royal Judah tribe, and Phares the other, as we heard. And this is just reiterating the fact that the Israelites were shepherds. So Zara means to appear, to rise, dawn, a start, the first. Remember, he was the first out when the midwife stuck the red thing around his wrist, out his hand, and a red thread tied around his hand. He was the firstborn. And it came to pass at the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb, and the midwife put the scarlet red thread. This came out first. That whole thing is enormous with the whole province of Ulster. Even as you read it, there's famous, even as I'm reading it, it's almost reading like the Cuchulainn and the Red Branch of the Fighters, which some of us might know about in Irish folklore. I'm not going to read that again because we've already read it. Well, that's not what I want to do. Sorry. Yeah, just down here. As those migrating men of the Zara tribe sailed west, possibly in the ships of Dan, the tribe of Dan, and they left their name with Dan's name. The island of Sardinia comes from the two of those, Zardin. So you know, most people have heard of the island of Sardinia, Sicily, Sardinia. So you can see how it possibly came from a mix of the two tribal names of Zar and Din, which is interesting. The tribe of Zara settled also, as we'll see later on, the ancient city of Zaragoza and the Ebro River, which is in Spain, hence the city name. Gaza, which we often see in the Middle East today, means strong in Hebrew, and Zaragoza is Zara's stronghold. The poet Homer, Iliad, so that in Greek history, Homer's pretty famous, and the Iliad is a famous book written by Homer, and he tells the story of the Battle of Troy, but it's made to look like as if it's Greeks, when possibly in reality, it's actually talking about a battle between Israelite tribes. Prince Paris from Troy, a Zarahite prince, had returned home to Troy with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of the Danaan city of Sparta in Greece, that began the 10 years of the Trojan Wars, when the king launched 1,000 ships of Dan to attack Troy to get his wife back. Remember, Troy was founded by Darda, a Zarahite of Judah. Paris the Trojan had been in Sparta negotiating a peace treaty when he came to love Helen, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. And this guy just mentions about the fact the city of love was named for her. Paris in France was named for that famous Trojan warrior who loved her so much and began the Trojan Wars. He just mentions about a couple of movies that I've just scribbled out because I can. So hopefully you're still with me. So we've moved, just shown the link between now as we come to the Trojan origins of the European royalty. So this whole thing of Troy links even very much to English history as well as Irish history. According to the British historian Ninninus, a group of people under the leadership of Brutus invaded England some 1100 years before the Messiah and set up a dynasty of British kings. Who was Brutus and where did he come from? The legends and histories of the ancient world trace Brutus and his throng back to Italy and through his ancestors back to Troy, of Homer. Read the fascinating story of an Israelite refugee who founded a famous city of Troy on the Dardanelles. So this guy Darda, or Dara again, and started several lines of Judite kings that are still in existence today. And most of us know what happened with the horse. Yeah, there's a saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Well, maybe it should have been beware of Israelites bearing gifts, especially Dan and maybe Simeon. So that's why Dan never gives out any presents in the fellowship. You probably noticed that already because we're on to him already. He's always horsing around. If you study the Iliad, because remember, it's people, it's when you look to see who people are, people will look at their family heraldry, and countries have heraldry as well, you know, different representatives of the country. So in the Iliad, if you look at it, you'll see that Troy were painted with heraldry symbols that represented the clans present at the conflict. The leaders of the Greek armies carried shields decorated with both eagles and lions. And we know the eagle is representative of the tribe of Dan. We just seen it a while ago. And we know that the lions are representative of the tribe of Judah. And while the Trojan defenders also had lions on their shields. So this is more and more, as you look at it, is a bit of a civil war going on between a couple of tribes of Israel who've migrated to Greece. The Iliad also describes a huge eagle as appearing over the contending armies at the siege of Troy. What do these symbols mean? Josephus, he's a famous historian, in his Antiquities of the Jews records that the Lacedaemonians, which was another name for the Spartans, King Arius sent an embassy to the Jewish high priest acknowledging that the Jews and the Spartans were racially akin, both having descended from Abraham. A later high priest sending an envoy to visit the Spartans recalled the incident. So Josephus is again much later in history talking, and we'll have a look at that letter in a few minutes, about the fact that the Spartans claimed to be brothers of the Jews. So they were one of the other tribes. I believe it was a mixture of possibly Dan and Simeon. It is of the greatest interest to read the seal on the letter from Sparta showed an eagle holding fast a serpent, which is straight out of the scriptures. That was one of his emblems. These emblems are Israelite of the tribe of Dan. The Spartans had preserved it for their official transaction. This indicates that the Greeks of this time were of Hebrew origin. That's important, you know, in what we're looking at here. What about the line of the Trojans in Genesis 49, 9-11? Provides the answer. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall arouse him? The lion, therefore, is the emblem of the tribe of Judah and is usually shown in a couched position. Could the Trojans be of the tribe of Judah, Jews in fact, and were the Greeks and the Trojans of the same stock? Which is kind of a different insight into what you've always thought, because we just thought it was a battle between Greeks. In First Chronicles, we read of the line of Judah, the sons of Judah, again about Chalcol and Darda, and just showing that there's other historical evidence to link back to these names. So these are the historians linking it back. And just maybe down the migration of Dardus in this part. The early migration of Dardus is noted in the book How Israel Came to Britain. A group of Israelites began to migrate away from the main body before Israel nation was formed. While as people they were still in bondage of Egypt, one of these groups under the leadership of Chalcol who we seen is on the line of Zarah, of the tribe of Judah, went westwards into the Mediterranean, eventually settling in Ulster. Another under the leadership of Dardanus, or Darda, or Dara, whatever name you want to call him, but it's all linked to the same guy, crossed to Asia to found the kingdom later known as Troy. And just again, in the scriptures, if you're ever looking in your Bible where it says Dara, sometimes in the margin it says Darda. So again, just linking this. So I think that's enough about him for a second. Again, the Mycenaean Greek civilization came into existence around 1600 BC. They originated in Egypt. You see, the Mycenaeans or the Arcanians were Israelite colonists of the tribe of Dan and Judah who left Egypt in ships and came upon the cities of the Greek peninsula, and the names these Mycenae, Pylos, and Sparta. And the Danaanites, who left Egypt before the Exodus, took the majority of the Greek cities, same names again. The Judites, again, two brothers, again, just linking this history. And you know, before I used to look at this, and I never really noticed how on the Zarah line it does. Some of us have seen this around the fellowship. This picture has been in some of the old revival magazines and stuff, and I never, to be honest, noticed the link here with the Trojan and the Greeks, and later on the Milesian kings. Miltos is also a place in Greece where possibly the name the Milesians come from. So just to show Israel, it's not that far really if you sail ships. There's Sparta, and over here is reputed to be Troy somewhere. Down here is where you come through what's called the Hercules Pillar, or the Rock of Gibraltar, which is all down here and leads out to the Atlantic and on into the British Isles. So it makes sense that if you were migrating, that this is the way you would go in a ship. And we were told that Dan was in his ships. But what about Simeon? So we've looked at Dan and we've looked at Judah this evening, how they've got there. Here's another thought, and this is this letter that Josephus was referring to. And this was from a watch magazine called Watch Jerusalem, the Spartans, children of Abraham, brothers of the Jews. They are famous as a savage, militaristic society built entirely around their armed forces. They were great soldiers. Spartan men existed to make war. Spartan women existed to make warriors. And Spartan slaves existed to do essentially everything else. They are probably best known for their lopsided stand against the joint Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae, reimagined in the famously inaccurate film 300. Most of us have probably seen the movie 300 with, what's his name? Something Butler, Gerard Butler. Butler's an Irish name, of course, so it must be linked. And according to an early 3rd century BCE letter from a Spartan king Ares to the Jewish ruler Ananias, they were also descendants of Abraham and brothers of the Jew. The remarkable letter from the Lacedaemonian king, the official name of the Spartan territory, is presented by 4th century historian Josephus in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, as well as in the Maccabees, which is another Jewish book. So that's the movie, that's Gerard Butler, that's not the original guy. And this is it. This is the letter. We have met with certain writings whereby we have discovered both the Jews and the Spartans are of one stock and are derived from the kindred of Abraham. It is but just therefore that you, who are our brethren, should send to us any of your concerns as you please. We will also do the same thing and esteem your concerns as our own, and we will look upon your concerns as in common with yours. Diamotilus, who brings this letter, will bring your answer back to us. This letter is 4 square seen as an eagle with a dragon in his claws. There is no record of Ananias's reply. As an aside, Ananias was the son of Judah, the last chronological biblical high priest mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 22. However, over a century later, the first Maccabees chapter 12 reports a follow-up message sent to Sparta by an embattled high priest, Jonathan, attempting to shore up alliances. But how could the Jews and Spartans be related? What did the Spartan certain writings say? This is just a history. There's the true guy who was really there at the 300 battle. Do you recognize that face? It's my body, but it's Paddy's face. This is just, again, where Sparta is and some of the stuff that was used, a bit of their history. But most of us recognize it from the 300. So the Spartan Israelites who halted the Persian Empire, Spartan warriors were Israelites, possibly from the Israelite tribe of Simeon, which, like the Spartans, was known for being warlike and ruthless. Again, it talks about that later. The Bible actually does not offer a solid historical context where the Spartans could have originated from a group of Israelites that branched off from the rest of the Israelite tribes. In the book of Numbers, there are two separate censuses, which we looked at last week, and you'll see that the tribe of Simeon has reduced dramatically. So again, this is just a guy called Steve Collins. I read some of his books. He's a Jew, and obviously he has Irish ancestry with a name Collins. And he's just talking about the fact that the tribe of Simeon, and we'll see it later on, that there is a thread through the Miletians, because Miletians means mill of Spain, and they were known as soldiers. And we'll see when we get to Ireland how this particular tribe has its links to some of the cities in Ireland. But it's just interesting. Maybe it wasn't Simeon, maybe it was Dan, but I think what you can pick up is they probably weren't Greeks. They were definitely Israelites in some form. As a sidebar, he makes this point. It's interesting that it was 300 in the movie and in history. And of course, that number is familiar to us when we read in the book of Judges how the Lord reduced an army of 30,000 under Gideon, and he brought it right down to what number? 300. So again, this would be in the Israelite history and in the Israelite psyche. So it's just, again, it's just an interesting thought that these three tribes have already started to migrate and move towards the promised land. And that's enough for this week. And all the people said, can't hear you.
Very good. Well done.
And
Yeah, Don.